This is the Beaver Island crash, yeah. We vacation there every summer, have for years. My wife and I honeymooned on Beaver Island. I heard about that. Oh, my.
They crash going into landing?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I heard.
Yes,
Yeah.
go. You can introduce. Using this? No, he's going to introduce himself. Oh,
Yeah,
all right,
yeah,
all right.
that's fine.
We're good. He's
Okay.
all set up already. Okay,
Yeah.
you ready to go?
Ready to go?
Yeah. So just, I'm not seeing you right now, so.
Oh.
Right. Just, camera so that.
How's that?
That's
Better?
wonderful. That's
good.
Better?
Closer to the camera.
Okay.
I'll make sure you stay on.
Okay. All right. In the COVID era in which we live, getting the technology right is not always easy. So thank you, Kim, for making this second class possible. Welcome to everybody here in the room. There are, about 10 or 12 of us, and a bunch of folks online. And I need to look at the camera here, even though my screen is behind me. I see my father-in-law, Cal. Good to see you. And some other names. So let me begin. You may or may not know, Judy, sorry to put you on the spot here, but I think I would be remiss if we didn't mention that Bill died on Sunday.
Sunday morning. I was on my way to church. He just didn't wake up that morning.
Yeah.
6 o'clock he was fine, sleeping well. 8 o'clock he was gone. And while I was at church, hospice was called, Dykstra was called.
Yeah.
They took his body. We tried to get his body. He wanted to be used for medical purposes. We tried to get his body to Michigan State or to Western. And Michigan State said, he's had COVID in the last month. We can't take him.
Mm.
Western said, you haven't pre-registered him. We can't take him. So
Oh.
he's going to have a faster burial than we thought. He's going to be cremated and find his rest at Hope Church's Memorial Garden.
Yeah. So let's take just a moment, silence. If you're the praying type, silent prayer. If not, just reflect. And again, Judy, we're very sorry. Though I know last week you were hoping it would be painless and relatively quick. So
It's worked out according to
yeah.
plans.
Okay.
Yeah, God's plan.
Let's take a moment of silence in honor of Bill. Living God, you who knew grief and pain, hear these prayers. Be with Judy and her family and friends in this time of loss. May she know of your comforting embrace and of your love, everlasting and eternal. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit we pray. Amen. Greetings. Anyone new here? It looks like some familiar faces, but anyone new in the room?
I was on Zoom last week.
Okay. Name and favorite thing you like to...
It's not going to work this way. I mean,
Well, we'll do this then. Name and favorite thing you like to eat at Thanksgiving.
I'm named Sue Bolander, and I love my grandmother's homemade stuffing, and I learned how to make it, and I'm going to make it again this year.
Grandma's homemade stuffing. How many of you have a recipe like that in your Thanksgiving repertoire? Yeah, I know in my family it's grandma's or grandpa's homemade stuffing, so yeah. Okay. Again, welcome to everybody online. Priscilla, Cal and Barb, who else is up there? Any other folks? They may be hidden. Kim is working technology here, so all right. Okay. You see on the slide here, the outline of the course. Last class, a week ago, we talked about ecological virtues in general, and particularly wonder and humility. We're going to focus on self-control, wisdom, justice, and behind that picture there is justice and love. So what do you remember from last class? Quiz time. Not one of those quizzes. Relax. All my psychology...
Repeat what he said.
Yeah, psychology friends say the best way to start a class is ask people what they remember from the previous class. So, David.
Repeat what he said.
Go ahead.
Do I use your mic over
That one
there?
doesn't work well.
Next won't work.
No, right here. We're using this one.
I remember, because it's so important to me in my life, is wonder. Because when I am out on my deck in the morning for my morning quiet time, or when I'm out in the woods, wonder is the main occupation that I have.
I love it. Wonder is the main occupation. All right. Anyone else? What do you remember from last class? Anything?
I remember what I said about, I can't remember what you asked us to write about someone.
Someone
This
you
would be
know
a
who-
list, right?
Yeah.
And I actually said the same thing. I wrote 3 people's names down and wrote the same thing for all 3 people.
Wow.
And I reread that today and I thought, yes.
You thought you were right. You weren't going to take any of that back.
I've been with them all 3 this week.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Remember from last class? Okay. Terry.
I remember the question you posed in addition to what's the right thing to do or what's the most loving, what brings about the most good, and that what kind of a person would act this way or would do this.
Okay. That's the key question when it comes to virtue ethics. What kind of person would do this? Anyone online? Unmute yourself and jump in here. What do you remember from last week's class?
Now, I will say,
Yeah, that's fine.
Patty Brink might be about to say something. Patty?
Steve,
What do you remember from last week? Anyone online? Jump
when you
in.
talk about wonder, traveling
Unmute
around,
yourself.
seeing the leaves.
No? Okay. Well, let's talk about last week just briefly. There we go. And here's some handouts. There you go. This will look familiar. No. This all looks familiar, similar to last time around. I hope I had enough, trying to not print too many things on paper, but just about right in class, okay? And the same thing here.
Make a comment and show make it again, so I can it in the classroom.
No? Okay. All right. Thank you. 2 main ways of thinking about ethics: conduct and character, duties, rights, consequences. And as I mentioned last time, I and a number of others are saying we need to focus more on character, on virtues and vices. That question, what kind of person would do something like that? Whether a praiseworthy action or a not so praiseworthy action, whether virtuous or vicious. And again, the fancy names there, the logos of duty or obligation, the logos of aims, goals, consequences, teleology, the logi or logos of arete, which is the Greek word for virtue or excellence. And I'm struck by what one of my friends, Jamie Smith, has written. What we do is driven by who we are, the kind of person we have become or are becoming. And this is my rather long definition of attempt to describe virtue. This is from Earthkeeping and Character. A story-shaped, praiseworthy character trait. That's why it's a virtue, not a vice. It's a praiseworthy character trait. Formed by practices over time that disposes us to act in certain good ways. Another way of saying it, this is Aristotle's definition, habitual disposition to act with excellence, molded by the narratives we identify with, and the exemplars, the moral role models. You all had some of those folks in mind last class. The moral exemplars we follow by soaking in the stories of particular communities, engaging in their practices, looking to their role models. We know what's truly good and how to live well. Alistair MacIntyre, a famous philosopher who really started the new recapturing of virtue ethics from the past. This is his book in 1980 called After Virtue. Says, before I can answer the question of what I am to do, I need to know the story, the narratives of which I am a part, and the practices that have shaped me. So a little review by way of just the general discussion here. So let me just conclude this review with a little section from the tail end of chapter 2 of Earthkeeping and Character. In a chapter entitled Knowing Our Place, in her book Small Wonder, Barbara Kingsolver reflects on the human exodus from mostly rural to mostly urban dwellings in the last century. It's a quote, "With all due respect for the wondrous ways people have invented to amuse themselves and one another on paved surfaces, I find this exodus from the land makes me unspeakably sad. I think of the children who will never know intuitively that a flower is a plant's way of making love, or what silence sounds like, or that trees breathe out what we breathe in." Continuing the quote here, "I wonder how they, these children, will imagine the infinite when they've never seen how the stars fill a dark sky. I wonder how I can explain why a wood thrush song makes my chest hurt to a populace for whom wood is a construction material and thrush is a tongue disease." End quote. If you know Barbara's work, you know that she's always going to get you with a laugh somewhere when you're reading something serious and you chuckle. Kingsolver laments what's being lost with this exodus. How will our children imagine infinite if they've never seen the Milky Way? And studies show that over half the children in this country have never seen the Milky Way because of, quote, light pollution where they live, among other things. How will they imagine sonorous beauty without hearing firsthand the loveliness of birdsong? What happens to our ability to wonder in an age in which opportunities to experience the natural world firsthand are few and far between? Richard Louv, L-O-U-V, he's been here in Holland. The Outdoor Discovery Center brought him a couple years ago after his award-winning book was published. He has a name for what Kingsolver laments. He calls it nature deficit disorder. It's one of the maladies of Children in America Day, he maintains. As he persuasively argues in his award-winning book, Last Child in the Woods, and he now has 2 books since that book was published, that talk about his remedy for this problem that he diagnoses. He writes, within the space of a few decades, the way children understand and experience nature has changed radically. Today, kids are aware of the global threats to the environment, but their physical contact, their intimacy with nature is fading, end quote. Louv documents this phenomena in its various manifestations and provides evidence from both natural and social sciences for why all people, adults as well as children, need nature to remain physically, emotionally, and spiritually healthy. And there is a growing amount of scientific evidence for all 3 of those kinds of health. Being in the natural world, just taking a walk in a park, increases emotional and spiritual health as well as your own physical health. Indeed, a chapter titled A Life of the Senses, Nature Virtue's Know-It-All State of Mind, Louv argues that nature-rich life fosters both, guess what? Wonder and humility. And I didn't steal those from his book. I was doing my work on those virtues before his book came out. In fact, the last 2 parts of Last Child in the Woods are entitled Wonderland, 2 words, and To Be Amazed. In an age dubbed the Anthropocene, that's the age in which historians and geologists now call the time in which we live, the human-centered age, the age of the human, how can we be reminded that we are not the center of the universe? When so easily coaxed into believing that we humans are far superior to all other creatures, really? Can we humans run as fast as a gazelle? Smell the way our dogs and cats can? Think of all kinds of other ways in which non-human creatures are better than we are. What can we do to remind ourselves, as John Muir puts it, that we all travel the Milky Way together, trees and humans? How do we honestly acknowledge our proper place in God's scheme of things? Humble humans from the humus. That's Genesis chapter 2. Made in God's image, Genesis chapter 1. Called to serve and protect God's good earth, Genesis 2:15. So wonder and humility. We went over this last time, I hope. Did we not? Should be on the flip side of my students. I searched for a name for this color. One student nailed it, salmon. The salmon-colored sheet. Is that about right? Yeah? Okay. So there you have a summary, and folks online should see this slide, wonder and humility. What wonder is, what the virtue of wonder is, this settled disposition of attentiveness to and awareness of what is beyond our expectations, a cultivated capacity to be amazed or astonished. Insensibility being the vice of deficiency, of incapacity or inability to wonder or be amazed. And misplaced wonder, my term for people who are amazed by things that really aren't that amazing. You know, the stock market hit a new record the other day. Really, does that evoke wonder? Or other things I could mention and do mention in the book. Humility is the other virtue that goes, I think, with wonder. Modest and honest assessment of one's abilities and accomplishments. The virtue of humility is, again, a settled disposition to estimate our abilities and capacities properly. I think I told this story last time, but of a student I had who won a national championship. National championship as a swimmer. Did I mention that last time?
Mentioned it Sunday.
On Sunday. That's why I'm getting these classes mixed up. Which Sunday and what's Tuesday? I had a student some years ago who was on the swim team, national championship, Division III swimmer. I think it was like a sprint, like 100 freestyle. And she came to class, and I congratulated her and said, no big deal. I said, really? Self-deprecation, that's a vice. She should have said, I'm really proud of that, proper pride. Because I worked my butt off for fill-in-the-blank years. 10 years? I mean, swimmers start young. And I'm grateful to, I wish she'd said, my coach, my parents, driving me back and forth to swim meets for, ever. Attending all my meets, as my parents did, every single football game I played for 12 years, including 4 at Hope College. Other people who supported her, owning that achievement and saying, yeah, it's Division III, not Division I. I'm not the fastest swimmer in the world. I'm not going to make the Olympic team, but this is something I'm really properly proud of. Rather than self-deprecating or, not enough humility, thinking, yeah, I'm going to make the Olympics and win a gold medal. Well, probably not. So where's that middle place between these two vices where we have the proper virtue of humility? To estimate our abilities and capacities properly. The vices here, as I've suggested, overweening pride. The Greeks called it hubris. It's at the root of every Greek tragedy. That's why things go bad, go south, because someone is overly prideful. Typically someone in power. A king, a queen. Self-deprecation is the other vice. So ecological wonder and ecological humility, now apply these virtues to our role on our home planet. Disposition to stand in rapt attention and enthralled amazement in the presence of the awe-inspiring natural world. Settled disposition to act in such a way that we know our place and fit harmoniously into it, whether it's our local community here in Holland, Michigan, our bioregion, Great Lakes, or our home planet. Any questions before we tackle some new material? Okay. Let's talk about wisdom. We'll get to self-control eventually, but wisdom. Find one other person in the room, someone close to you, online if you're together with someone. If not, just get out a piece of paper or on your laptop or tablet and just talk about what exactly is wisdom. You've got 3 minutes. What is wisdom? You are a wise group. What is wisdom? So again, if you're online by yourself, just jot some notes down on a piece of paper. Or if you're with someone, again, just have a conversation. What exactly is wisdom for a couple minutes?
Where were you? Right, I know, it's a wonderful sort of rhetoric of, you're not so great after all, but we think we are. And of course, then the other is not Western tradition of Proverbs, and there's so many little pithy little things in Proverbs that it's hard to categorize it into.
What's the opposite of wisdom?
I would say, given what I was just saying, is arrogance.
Okay.
And it's so easy to be arrogant. I mean, somebody like Steve works hard to get a PhD, entitles you to certain things, and it's easy to say, I know because I've gone this journey. So it's a difficult one.
But there's some people that take that same journey and they realize there's so much they don't know.
Yeah, right.
So it could go either way. It sort of depends again on maybe their basic character of which way that goes.
I think that
1 minute.
too often we equate wisdom with age, and there is a correlation there, but I think I know of people who are quite young who are very wise. So I think there's one category of wisdom is life experience
Yeah,
and
okay.
learning from life experience.
Okay.
And the openness to learn rather than just talk up achievements. How about you? What do you think?
I think it has a connection with knowledge and intelligence. It's applying knowledge that you have by using your intelligence. Knowledge plus intelligence puts you toward wisdom. I don't know if that's enough, but that would be something that I might add to it.
Yeah, I think for me, the pitfalls of knowledge is like having a bag of stuff bag that you carry around with you. So I think I would add to knowledge, discernment.
And how would you describe or define discernment?
Always has an open question about whatever it is that you're dealing with. And the openness invites an ability to look at different facets of whatever the phenomena is.
Okay, so you're not just taking one point of view, you're understanding there's more than one point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's
Okay.
so fundamentally so lacking
Right.
in public discourse right
Right.
now. There's
Very
very
good. I mean, we're all trained to be like what I think, yeah.
Okay, I hate to cut off your conversations, but let's share it together. And again, I'll walk around the room with this mic and share a bit about, with everybody, what you talked about in your small group. We'll start here in the room and then also invite those of you who are online to share your reflections. So someone get us started.
We need to have the mic so they can.
Yep, I'll move around with the mic. Anyone? Sue.
Okay. What came to mind first off is a serenity prayer from Al-Anon or AA, and knowing the things I cannot change, the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And the wisdom, there's no black and white concrete thing, but discernment and learning and growing. And as you move through a process, you get more wisdom, but it's always changing. And I think wisdom is growth and able to learn new things and be able to adapt and change with it.
Okay. You mentioned a couple words I know some other groups are talking about, discernment, right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Someone else. Wisdom. The courage to change things that need to be changed, the serenity to accept things that cannot be changed, and the wisdom to know the one from the other. Yeah. Someone else. Insights on wisdom. Judy. You were taking notes, my goodness.
That's helpful. It's a wise thing I do. And we thought about 3 parts of wisdom. It has to do with knowledge and the application of intellect to that, and then discernment is the third part, a kind of trinity there that together make up wisdom.
Okay, what's that trinity again?
Knowledge, intelligence, and discernment.
All right, knowledge, intelligence, and discernment. Thank you. Someone else share what you talked about in your small group. Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I would add insight, intuition, understanding, and balance.
Insight, intuition, understanding, and balance. Say a little bit more about balance. I think I know what you mean by the first 3, but what exactly did you have in mind with balance?
Balance would be considering various viewpoints, not just staying with one viewpoint, but being open and evaluating what you have.
Okay. All right, that came up, I think, in some other groups, at least from what I could hear from your conversations. Thank you. Someone else share some of your thoughts and reflections on wisdom. Yeah.
It's interesting that you included intelligence, because we talked about that it wouldn't have to include intelligence. It could be experience, it could be living life, and we aren't necessarily, just because we're old, wise. I learn a lot from the younger generation, of which I will never experience or live through. So maybe that's discernment in whom you learn, who you turn to for wisdom. I think I'm going to go home and think about all the different parts of my life and who was the wise person that influenced me or affected me or guided me. There's going to be a multitude of people that right now probably aren't even in my head, but it'll be interesting to see who had wisdom in my life.
And you're raising a couple of questions I'm going to come back to here shortly, and that is, are intelligence and wisdom the same thing, or what's the relationship there? And does wisdom always go with age? Is there a positive correlation between age and wisdom, such that if you're older, generally you're more wise? You're calling both of those into question, it seems to me. Anyone online want to jump in here? Unmute yourself and share some of your reflections on what wisdom is. Anyone?
Maybe Kim hasn't solved the problem. David's word has got a box on like he's talking.
Oh, we can't hear him though. David, if you can hear us, we can't hear you. I'm not sure why. Kim's working on it, but we can't hear you.
Hi, this is Karen. Should I step in a second here while he's waiting?
Yeah, please do.
Um,
Go ahead, Karen.
to me, wisdom was always something as a child that I thought was something you gained with age. But through aging, I kind of have this idea that wisdom is the results that are guidelines that we've developed through experience, knowledge, learning, instinct, all the things that roll up into our life that we analyze and apply our knowledge of truth and right and care and concern for others. And all that rolls up and develops this guideline that we think and act by. And so to me, that wisdom is at all different stages, because you're learning at all different stages, and you just refine that as we get older and experience new things.
So do you think there is a correlation between wisdom and age then? That older people in general are more wise than younger people?
Nope, I don't think it's based on age. I think that a person who is open to the learning, the truths, the analysis, that you can have a very wise 9-year-old and a very unwise 90-year-old. But I do think that it's an ongoing process that we all go through as we learn new things, we experience new things, and whether our mind is open or not, all of those things play into the wisdom that we develop. But I feel strongly that there is a component of applying truths to that. It just can't be, hey, I'm going to go out and do drugs every day and get high, and this is awesome. This is a great wisdom. You know, it's really about improving, to me, the actions that show care and concern for the world.
So wisdom is not simply free expression of your desires. It's something that makes you and your world a better place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good way to say it.
Anyone else, either in the room, or online? Oh, here we go.
I think being wise has an aspect of humility in it. That you didn't know that you didn't come up with this on your own, but you got it from things. So there's a humility.
So we're back to humility. Humility shows up here as well. Okay. So if I say I'm humble and proud of it, there's something wrong with that. I'm proud of my humility. Let's look at another handout. Let me click the screen here. We'll get to wisdom, but first self-control. Judy, if you'd help me out there. Living with strength of mind and discernment, my rough and ready, quick summaries of these virtues of self-control and wisdom. I begin and end this chapter with stories from Wendell Berry, which I'm not going to read, but they're in the book if you want to talk about that. Some ruminations first about self-control. Again, we're going to get to wisdom, but first self-control. In our contemporary American culture, self-control, it seems to me anyway, has a bad rap. Let go, get it all out, give up control seems to be the motto of our day. Self-restraint, moderation, temperance, this virtue goes by many names, seems so old-fashioned, like remnants of an antiquated Victorian culture, thankfully, long past. But, and I've actually done this. Oh, can you get it? Talk to any school teacher or sports team coach or a music instructor, violin, piano, doesn't make much difference, or work boss, and they will insist on the importance of self-control. Indeed, any functioning group, whether a class at school, a team at work, or a family at home, requires a certain level of self-control from its members for it to function. Without some semblance of self-control, needs are not met, feelings are overlooked, and frustration rules the roost. No surprise then that ancient Greece and Rome, one of the four cardinal virtues, whatever name it went by, was self-control. One of the four cardinal virtues for Plato, for Aristotle, his most famous student, and within the Christian tradition, this virtue of self-control morphed into the virtue of temperance. We don't use that word much anymore, but for much of the Christian tradition, that was the word used to describe self-control. Or the spirit of the virtue of temperance was captured by Henry David Thoreau, one of my favorite Thoreau quotes. Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind, end quote. Articulating what seems now to be a long-lost appreciation for simplicity and frugality, Thoreau strenuously insists that we must distinguish genuine needs from mere wants by recognizing that many so-called comforts actually get in the way of our flourishing. This venerable tradition of temperance and simplicity, I don't need to tell you this, but it runs counter to the materialistic culture of today. And perhaps especially, I was commenting with some students actually earlier today about how much earlier Christmas advertising is now than it was even 10 or 20 years ago. There was sort of a sacrosanct border that didn't start till after Thanksgiving, and now it's happening before Halloween. There's ample evidence that the supposed connection between more stuff and happiness is an illusion. My Hope College colleague and next-door neighbor, social psychologist David Myers, probably the most famous Hope professor ever because of the use of his Intro to Psych and Intro to Social Psych textbooks, which are now in their 12th, 13th editions. Millions of people all over the world know David Myers because of his textbooks. David captures well the conclusions of much social science research from the last 30 years. I quote, and this is all in italics in David's text here, one of his books. Our becoming much better off over the last 30 years has not been accompanied by one iota of increased happiness and life satisfaction. It's shocking because it contradicts our society's materialistic assumptions. I'm continuing the quote. But how can we ignore the hard truth, colon, and again, all in italics, David's. Once beyond poverty, further economic growth does not appreciatively improve human morale, end quote. We think making more money and having more stuff will make us happier. This is me now commenting on this, but we're deluded. Once a person or family rises above the poverty line, there's no correlation between happiness and wealth. More stuff does not lead to more satisfaction. As one person fetchingly put it, the good life is not the goods life. From his research, David draws this conclusion. Realizing that well-being is something other than being well off is liberating. It liberates us from spending on $1,800 dresses on stockpiles of unplayed CDs, on luxury cars, on seagoing luxury homes, all purchased in a vain quest for an elusive joy. Knowing this, David's quote continues, liberates us from envying the lifestyles of the rich and famous. Giving up the illusion that happiness is found in owning more stuff is indeed liberating. Somewhat more recently, this has been picked up by Pope Francis in his much read and widely acclaimed Laudato Si. He speaks of moderation, simplicity, among many virtues that he talks about, the virtue of self-control. He also talks about gratitude as a virtue, a kissing cousin, as it were, of moderation and temperance and self-control. So in contrary to its negative reputation in much of contemporary, at least American culture, self-control is a means of freeing us from the kind of bondage. The virtue of self-control is a kind of cultivated strength of mind or will. There's a lot in the Bible about this. I'm not going to talk much about this. I did the Sunday school class on Sunday a couple days ago, but Jesus, the Apostle Paul, self-control, ekritia, as the Greek word, shows up in a number of his lists, including the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. But it's important to know that what self-control means in Scripture is not exactly the same thing as what Plato, Aristotle, or people today think about. Moderation in all things, that's not what St. Paul means by that. It doesn't refer to this sort of balance or moderation. Since some things we are to have great passion for, like justice and love. We'll get to those hopefully a little bit later today. So self-control is not the same as moderation in all things. Moderation in some things, but not all. So, habitual control of one's desires in order to have the right desire for the right kinds of things. Its vices are self-indulgence on the one hand and austerity on the other. Ecological self-control, the habitual disposition to control our desires when it comes to caring for the natural world, our home planet, based on a clear-eyed appraisal of what we have and truly need, and not just want, and an honest assessment of what others, human and non-human, need. We control our desires in order to foster the flourishing of others. Ecological self-control. All right, a little bit about wisdom. And you all had some very good things to say about it, as I expected. You are, in fact, a wise group. Back to the book, page 57, I make some of the same distinctions that you all were making. Argue that wisdom is not the same as sheer intelligence or smarts or brain power. These are good things, don't get me wrong. It's good to be intelligent, but intelligence is not the same as wisdom, for I know some very intelligent people who often act foolishly. Having a high IQ does not necessarily prevent foolish behavior. Second, wisdom is not the same as erudition or accumulated knowledge or book learning. These two are good things. I spent 14 years in graduate school. That's a good thing, I guess. Long time. But being erudite, other things being equal, is better than not being well-read. And one can learn much from good books. Just ask any university or college professor, those of you in this room. But such knowledge, I would argue, is not identical to wisdom, for well-read people, college professors included, can be fools. I'm not going to tell any stories or mention names, but I could, including some of my own foolish behavior. Scholars sometimes act foolishly. So third, wisdom is not merely technical knowledge or skill or know-how, what Aristotle calls techne. It's a kind of knowledge, but it's the root of the word technology. Know-how is a good thing, just like intelligence and book learning. It's good to know how to change your tire when you get a flat. It's good to know how to make a cake on your child's birthday. But having such skills is not the same as wisdom. For, once again, technically proficient people can be fools. So what is it? I argue, following Aristotle and Aquinas and a bunch of other people, I'm not inventing this, I'm not that smart. It's a kind of sound practical judgment. What Aristotle calls practical knowledge. Phronesis is the Greek word. And that's distinct from theoretical knowledge, what Aristotle calls Sophia. Right? Philosophy is the philia of Sophia, love of wisdom, but that's a particular kind of wisdom. And what I'm talking about here, and Aristotle's talking about, is a practical kind of wisdom. Practical from the Greek word praxis, action. And a number of you, I think almost every group mentions something like this. It's intelligence put in action to make the world a better place. Not just knowing theoretically, that's Sophia, what's going on, but actually living it out, putting it into practice. This sound practical judgment is sound precisely because it's informed by the collective experience of the community and guided by a keen discernment of what is good and true and right. So there's two dimensions, knowing what and knowing how. The wise person is sagacious or wise about the summum bonum, the greatest good. She knows from among all the candidates competing for our attention as the greatest good, which are counterfeit, like the God more stuff, capital M, capital F, that's a counterfeit God, knows which ones are counterfeit and which ones are the real deal. She knows what truly makes for the flourishing of all things. The wise person also has the practical knowledge. This is the second part. Doesn't just know what's going to bring about this greater good, but knows how to attain it individually, with other people, to secure the goal of the good life by living rightly. And I mentioned this, but it's important to note this sound practical judgment, this kind of practical wisdom, relies on the cultivated memory and collective experience of one's community. In other words, wisdom depends heavily on what we've learned from the past and what is passed on to us by our parents, family, and the larger community. In short, wisdom means learning from our ancestors, learning from the past so, as the old adage puts it, we don't repeat those mistakes. So, sound practical judgment based on cultivated memory, long-term experience of one's community, and preferably multiple communities, because this can become, incestuous if it's just a small community. If everyone in your community is racist, then you're probably going to be racist too. So you need to learn from other communities, other perspectives, outside perspectives, that maybe point out to us our own community's failings. Virtue of wisdom, settled disposition, you know that was coming, to make sound practical judgments informed by the accumulated experience of a community, and again, ideally multiple communities aimed at what is truly good. And its vice, I think there's only one in this case, is foolishness. So the wise person is disposed to make insightful and discerning judgments. Many of you mentioned insight and discernment, in addition to intelligence, in your discussions. The virtue of wisdom is shot through with an abiding awareness of life's precariousness, an understanding and prizing of the excellences of life, and an unwavering sense of thanksgiving for the sheer gift of life. As I recall, a student once wrote in a paper, I'm not making this up, this is some 20 years or so ago now, a Hope student, quote, "I realize now how fragile and delicate life really is, and that has helped me to appreciate it more. I also know that there are many things I cannot take for granted anymore. Awareness, appreciation, gratitude, such is the grammar of wisdom." So what's ecological wisdom? And again, there's much, before I talk about that, there's much in the Bible I talk about in the book on wisdom. There's a whole section of the Old Testament, a Hebrew Bible, called the wisdom literature. You were mentioning that, David. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, of course, the Psalms in particular. Almost every religious tradition has a genre of sacred literature that you could call wisdom literature of one sort or another. And it shows up in the New Testament as well. Paul often speaks of wisdom. And I have a page and a half just on St. Paul. From Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, he speaks about wisdom quite a bit in his love letters to the various churches in the first century. Ecological wisdom. The disposition, habitual disposition to make insightful and discerning judgments about our common home, the earth. We take seriously, this is on your handout here, the cycles and scales of the natural world. We see everything connected to everything else. We take the long view if we're ecologically wise, thinking in terms of decades and even centuries, and thus plan far ahead. And we expand our range not only with regard to time, but also space. We see everything connected to everything else, and so adopt the canoe camper's version of the golden rule. Do you know this? Canoe camper's version of the golden rule? Treat those downstream as you would have those upstream treat you. Treat those downstream as you would have those upstream treat you. Humbly aware of the limits of our knowledge. This came up again, humility. Especially about the natural world, what we don't know, what unforeseen consequences there might be if we do X, Y, or Z. We exercise restraint since there are often unintended and unforeseen consequences to our actions. We adopt what ethicists call the precautionary principle, and thus go slowly when there are high levels of either uncertainty or risk. If you're not really certain about the consequences or there's great risk involved, go slow. Take precautions. Questions on self-control or wisdom, especially the ecological versions? Again, I'm happy to move around with the mic here.
This may be too big a question to talk about, but a few nuggets of suggestions. And it's triggered by this reference to the cycles and scales of the natural world.
Yeah.
In all of this, we're talking about instinctively human beings who represent a very narrow slice of the existence of Earth, much less the rest of the cosmos.
Right.
Or human history.
Even human history on this planet.
You know, so, you know, how does this scale up? I guess is kind of the question. All of this resonates very strongly with me if you talk about what should we do in Holland or what should I do tomorrow? Yeah. Or Leopold's story about the wisdom of the mountain, you know, worrying about the wolf and the deer, but, you know, there were billions of years before the wolf and deer, and there'll be billions of years after. So it's not really part of the course, but how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's Don talking about what exactly do we mean and how seriously are we to take discussions of different scales of time in particular, but also space. I just finished reading Richard Powers' latest novel, Bewilderment, and I got a first grade, or more than first grade, a first-rate education in astrobiology, and about other planets, other life in our universe, and the likelihood of it, which is actually quite high according to recent estimates by astrobiologists, and what life might be like, how different it might be than the life we know here on this planet. His earlier book, which won him the Pulitzer Prize, The Overstory, is also a magnificently written novel. Both of these are novels where I think I learned more about trees and forests than any tree book I own. But he's asking precisely the same questions, which came to mind when you posed your question here. Bewilderment. And it's thankfully a bit shorter than the Overstory, which is like 400 pages. Bewilderment's about 300 pages. And they're both beautifully written. The prose is just stunning. And the plot and the characters, it's first rate. I mean, this is his 12th or 13th novel, and he's at, as far as I can tell, in his 60s, he's at the top of his game as a writer. But he asks precisely these kinds of questions, especially the new book. It's all about rethinking who do we think we are? We humans on our little planet in even a galaxy. Forget the universe. Just think of a galaxy that is mind-bogglingly large that we cannot wrap our mind around. And so it's a fair question. I'm hearing on the other end of my brain Wendell Berry saying, forget the cosmic scales of things. Just do what you can in your home turf. About local economy, and that's important too. We have to have a big picture, but we can't forget to do what we can on our plot of land, in our little town or city, in our individual communities. So that's where I tell people to start, because often they feel so overwhelmed by matters of scale. Global climate change, what can little old me do? What can one person do? You hear that all the time. And it's a legitimate concern, given how global that, now it's called crisis or emergency, climate crisis, climate emergency, is. So, we have to do both as best we can. Not just do our thing, plant that tree, take care of the local park, but also maybe write a member of the House or Senate, or maybe a local politician of some sort to say we need to have these structural, socio-political changes as well as the sorts of things that we can directly control in our own life. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a great question. What exactly do people who write about ecological ethics, what do they mean by scale in both time and space? Because we're quite finite, even though our temptation is to think that we're at the center of the universe. Yeah? Oh. Getting exercise today.
I'm also thinking it's a personal thing, but also the corporate thing. I just read a New Yorker article about these companies that now deal with natural disasters, and they go all over the country and supply people. But what they're doing is they're taking immigrants from other countries. They're not housing them, paying them, or giving them the safety things they are, and often not even paying them. They're getting all the money from the feds to do the work. So the corporate ethical things, here it's taking care of our world after things have really gone bad, but then totally mistreating the people that are doing the work. And some of the companies mentioned were companies here in Michigan. And they hire people, they get all kinds of money, then they abuse the people doing the work, and then they move on to another place. And I think we have to think about not only our individual thing, but in the corporate world. How is the corporate world treating the world and treating the people that are taking care of it?
That's a great question, and the first term that comes to mind is one that's now found after many years of sort of reclusive existence, 30 years I can think of actually. The term's been around, but now it's become more commonplace, thankfully. Environmental justice, a term that attempts to combine the concern for environmental care, earthkeeping, care creation, whatever you want to call it, and justice for people, especially, who bear the brunt of ecological degradation, who are abused in situations like the one you just described. So how do we combine social justice issues and concerns with our concern for caring for creation? And you put, because they have to be seen together. Everywhere I've gone on this planet, they're always connected. You ask the right questions, you'll find out that that particular environmental degradation is connected to some injustice to certain people, and vice versa. And now we're beginning to see those connections, but we still have to figure out, how do we have a company that makes money, because it's got to stay in existence, but does so in a way that cleans up environmental messes, but in a way that doesn't exploit people, right? So it's a great question. And my hunch is, more than a hunch really, is that if you find a way to do that, you're going to have a prosperous future running that business, because that's the direction the world's headed. Environmental is becoming an adjective in virtually every academic discipline now, and in the same with fields of study, careers. So, great question. Any other questions? Before I do something easy like talk about justice.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I had somebody, when I was talking to once, tell me that in the things that we do, it is the power of choice that makes the biggest impact for us and the ripple effect as it spreads out. And sometimes when we look at these big, huge corporate situations and things that are so overwhelming, if we take just our choice and others see that and we don't have fear about it, then as that happens and it spreads, don't buy that from that company or the products that they make. It is really a hard thing to do because you don't know how to find out, but it does make me stop and think when I make even little choices. Is this the choice? So I just thought that was really profound for me.
Thank you, Karen. You raise a very, very good point. I often, with students especially, find that they are consequentialists even though they've never heard the term. That's the dominant ethic of our age. It says, why do something if the prospects of having positive consequences are very little? Why pick up that piece of trash in the middle of the Pine Grove on campus as you're going to class? I mean, what can one little person do, one little thing? And they're implicitly saying that the moral worth of an action is measured in terms of potential good consequences. And my advice to them is to say, don't be a consequentialist. Spike Lee, famous African-American filmmaker years ago, captured it in one of his films. Do the right thing. Do the right thing. Do it because it's the right thing to do. You never know what good consequences could follow. Leave the consequences to God if you believe in God. Do the right thing. I mean, did Martin Luther King Jr. know what the positive consequences would be in the late 50s when he started civil rights? That we'd have laws in this country enacted to prevent racial injustices? I mean, can we really predict with the kind of certainty we sometimes think we have the future good consequences? No. Again, we're finite, fallible human beings. Do the right thing. Maybe someone will see you and also do that thing. And you'll never know about it, which is fine. Maybe you'll start something. But even if that doesn't happen, you've done the right thing. Even if the consequences are small or minimal. So, and again, it comes back to that quote. I won't go back on the slide, but Jamie Smith's quote, that what we do is a function of who we are, what virtues we happen to embody. So, because we're people who embody certain ecological virtues, I hope, we do the right thing when the time comes. Whether anyone's watching or not, whether there'll be any, quote, good consequences or not. So, great questions. All right. I don't wear a watch, so I got my smartphone here to keep me on track. It's a little after 2. So, let's talk about justice. Okay, you got 5 more minutes in your small group. What is justice? Talk about that together. What is justice? And again, online, if you're with someone, what is justice? Just take a few minutes and talk about that. If you're by yourself, simply jot down on a piece of paper, on your laptop, on a tablet, just your reflections on what in the heck is justice. Okay, you got a couple minutes.
Inequality, I think, is one of the themes that prompts a need for justice. It's a response to inequalities, and none of us, we're not equal. Some have more than others. And I'm a socialist communist when it comes down to that kind of notion of justice. I think that when you've got extremes at one end where you've got a few people just making just tons and tons of money, and then you've got so many people that are just living paycheck to paycheck, if they have that. Somehow that to me is injustice. If we can somehow bring more balance in your inequalities.
Here's my little because I picked up the little box turtle and put him on the side of the road where he could go. So there's the justice part of it. Box turtles are getting increasingly rare because people are going to the woods and capturing them for the pet. So it's not just a little incidental activity, it is a justice related.
Okay, so what are people doing with box turtles?
Well, they capture them and then they take them to the Asian markets.
Asia likes box turtles?
Well, they like little turtles. They like their little pets. You can put them in a box and feed them, and you get nature, which you don't have nature.
Well, it's like zoos. We took animals from Africa to make our zoo.
Oh, I know. That's another justice issue because it's exploiting nature for our own perverted needs. And that's a difficult one because you can push it out to say, if I feed the birds on my feeder, and hence they get dependent on my feeder, is that a justice issue for these birds who have to learn how to feed in their natural habitat? I don't have an answer to that, but it's how you can push the justice issue beyond just what seems to be a clear black and white kind of thing.
And push it beyond just what is it beneficial to me as a human being or what's beneficial to the animals, the creatures. Instead of thinking only about human justice, we extend the boundary to consider
I mean,
justice.
so, another angle of that is the latest rage in trips is eco-trips.
Okay?
And they're all based on people with lots of money can go to these places and look at birds and look at animals and feel like they would cheat something. At what cost to, one, the animals that they're viewing, and at one cost to the whole balance of wealth in our country where these wealthy people can do these sort of things and feel proud of it. It's a complex issue, I think, the whole justice issue.
A lot of people, I mean, you can see nature just by going to some parks around Ottawa County. You don't have to go
Right.
some exotic place. It depends on how sensitive your awareness is. If people just ignore what's so commonplace around us, then they don't appreciate it. That they gotta have some kind of exotic beauty or strangeness to evoke any kind of sense of wonder. And they're kind of jaded, I guess, people.
And there is, talking about animals who are in captivity. In the zoo,
Another minute.
there's much more consciousness about having animals as much as possible in their natural habitat.
Okay.
Rather than just having them in cages that you can
guard,
go and look
metal
at
bars.
them. Yeah.
Okay.
So there is a response to, and a lot of zoos now are doing captive breeding because the numbers of the animals
In the wild, they're diminishing.
So they're trying to revive or keep the species going. And I think that's a very much
We could get into issues of farming and free-range chickens
We
and that
could
kind
too.
of thing. So I'm gonna get back to my chair.
Okay, let's talk together about this issue. We'll solve the question of what is justice in 10 minutes or so, I'm sure. Someone get us started. What'd you talk about in your group? What's justice? Anyone? either online or here in person? Yeah, Dave. Yep.
Put your mask on too, David. Okay?
I think on the larger picture, not just in terms of environmental justice, but you know, there are things like the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter, which are very much justice issues.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't push that as much in terms of environmental stuff. We do talk about climate change, but most people who get really vexed about climate change is what is it going to do to me, rather than what is it doing to the ecological cosmos and how is climate change affecting that. So we tend to still think of justice as a person or human thing, rather than justice for the whole of life, which is all part of God's creation.
Thank you. We'll come back to that. I began the chapter on justice with discussions of environmental injustice and precisely those issues. Someone else? What you talked about in your small group? Online folks, feel free to jump in, unmute yourself. Judy.
I'm not sure how much this has to do with ecology, but my whole feeling, at least as a human being, the justice has to do with resolving the inequalities that are around us. If we can do something to encourage those that have much to share with those who have little, I think we would be achieving some justice.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll throw mine out there again.
Okay.
I took justice, I take things from an action standpoint. So I think of it as acting based on ethics, rationality, natural law, equity, and concern.
Okay. Any one of those from that list you think is most important? You talk about justice?
To me, concern is always the number one item in my list. But it can't be concern for me, so the ethics and natural law, understanding that it all plays a part in there, because to do something just because I want to do it or because it makes sense or the current culture is running down a path of a TikTok type of environment, it's still based on ethics to me.
Okay. And by that, you emphasize both care, and I heard you say equity.
Yes.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Thank you very much, Karen. Sharon, you're next.
Sue, when we first started our discussion, Sue mentioned the book Just Mercy, and that led us down the path of talking about the role of mercy and compassion and what is truly justice, not just breaking a rule, a black and white tit for tat. There's something that looks beyond the consequence for a deed to what is more holistic, what will improve life for another, what will improve life for, I guess, put in ecological terms, the planet, the world around us, that is not black and white, this then that kind of thing. So that compassion and well-being and mercy, that's a piece of it.
Just Mercy is the title of the book. Who's the author? Brian Stevenson. Yeah, okay, I've seen it. I haven't read it yet. I'll add that to my list.
Say the name of the author again.
Brian Stevenson. With a V or a PH? I have to ask. Okay. All right. Yeah, okay. Well, maybe that's a good place to start, since if you have the handout, flip it over. It's the same green handout. And let me move the slide. Again, the first three are on justice, the concept, the virtue, and ecological justice. And the last 3, 4, 5, and 6, love, the virtue of love, and ecological love. I actually begin in the chapter, what chapter is it? Chapter 4, living with respect and care. Respect for rights and care for needs. I learned from Lewis Smedes, my venerable Fuller Seminary ethics professor, in his book Choices, among other books that he wrote, that those are the, I think, the best definitions of justice and love. Respect, he would say, for human rights and care for human needs. I'm going to push Lou, peace to his memory, he died a few years ago, and I think he would not disagree were he alive today. He was writing those words back in the 60s and 70s. Not just respect for human rights, but respect for rights of non-human things, and care not just for human needs, but for the needs of our non-human neighbors as well. I begin with a story, as with every chapter, in this case John Muir and also Annie Dillard. And then I begin actually where David mentioned with examinations of injustice. I talk about environmental racism, ecofeminism, which you don't hear much about these days, but it's connecting environmental issues not with issues of race and racism, with issues of the substandard treatment of women. Because Mother Nature maybe isn't so innocent a metaphor as we thought. If men are seen as over women, more important, more valuable, and women are identified with nature, then guess what? Humans end up being seen as somehow over, different from, distinguished from, and over nature. That's, in essence, the argument of ecofeminism. Then I have some meditations on love, but let me cut to the chase here, where I, as a Christian, the Bible is my first place to go in talking about justice and love. Justice is a key theme in the Bible, even though, sadly, many Christians, I think, do not know that. In the Old Testament, God requires of his people righteousness, tzedakah, or tzedak, and justice, mishpat. Indeed, they are integral to shalom, the word that's used again and again to describe the goal of all life, that all things will flourish. The grand vision of the flourishing of all things that permeates the Bible like the aroma of fresh baked bread in Grandma's kitchen. I can smell it already next week, right? All the baking we'll be doing, Thanksgiving. For example, the last half of the Decalogue declares justice to be a central feature of human flourishing. Exodus 20, 12 through 17. Stealing and bearing false witness are violations of justice. They're thefts of goods that rightly belong to someone else. And the covenant stipulations in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, these Bible chapters and books that most people don't ever read, include requirements to do justice, especially to the widows, the orphans, and the aliens. Not space aliens, but people who don't carry green cards. That's basically the contemporary equivalent. That's throughout the Torah, the first part of the Bible, as well as in the writings and the prophets, there's this emphasis on how are the widows, orphans, and people who are not citizens doing. That's how you measure the success of your country or your city. Likewise, the Hebrew prophets, Amos, Micah, Jeremiah. I'm not going to quote all the particulars. They're in the chapter. The wisdom literature itself, my favorite is Psalm 72, which speaks of both justice and love. God has pity on the weak and the needy, defends the cause of the poor, crushes the oppressor, etc. And so also in the New Testament, righteousness and justice are central to the words and deeds of Jesus and the message of the Apostle Paul. Whether it's Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, or a whole variety of texts, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, whole chapters in those love letters Paul devotes to righteousness, which can be translated justice just as easily from the Greek. So justice, I argue, fundamentally is fairness and equity. Not equality, but equity. Anyone who's been a parent knows this is a tricky distinction. You learn it relatively early on. For some things, you treat your children exactly the same, equally. But for other things, you treat them differentially in order to be equitable or fair. You don't require of your 4-year-old the same thing you require of your 14-year-old. At least we didn't in my family, tried not to. You expect more of an older child. So in order to be fair, you treat them differently in some circumstances. In others, you treat them exactly the same regardless of age. And here we're back to practical wisdom, because that's a requirement for justice, is knowing when treating people differently is actually equitable and when it isn't. What are the circumstances in which everyone gets treated the same, equality? But when would that be unjust to treat everyone the same? So, and this is fueled by respect. Respect for the integrity and well-being of the other, whether that's a human other or a non-human other. So the virtue of justice is the habitual disposition to treat others fairly when faced with the recognized rights or legitimate claims of creatures, both human and non-human. Recognized rights in the case of humans, perhaps not animals. This gets into a whole debate. Do animals have rights? If so, which ones and why? I don't want to talk about that now. But even if certain non-human creatures don't have rights, they have legitimate claims of creatures like us who are human agents. They may have value, not because they have rights, but because they have intrinsic value. They're valuable irrespective of their usefulness to us humans. And that means we humans need to respect that value. We not only respect the rights of all humans, but show respect for the value of domestic animals, wild plants, endangered species, and damaged ecosystems, just to give 4 examples of very different kinds of non-human entities for which we should strive for justice. So ecological justice, applying the virtue of justice to the oikos, to our home planet. Love, care, and compassion that promotes the good of another for the sake of another. I talk about the various, on pages 86 and following in Earthkeeping and Character, different words used for love. Steadfast love is the Hebrew chesed, probably the most important word in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. There's also faithfulness, emunah. These will embrace Psalm 85. Justice and love, faithfulness. Righteousness, tzedakah, and peace, shalom. Those 4 words, probably the most important vocabulary words in the Hebrew Bible. 4 more potent words in the Bible could not be found, especially in such close proximity. They're all within a couple verses of each other in Psalm 85. Chesed is the word we usually pay attention. Steadfast love, covenant love, indicates the love of God deep and wide. God's love that endures forever. Compassion that God has for us. New Testament, oiktirmon is the rough equivalent in Greek of chesed, mercy, compassion. And we're called to be merciful because we presumably worship a God of mercy and compassion. God is compassionate, so we also should be people of compassion. Compassio, now we're talking Latin, to feel with another, to suffer with another. It's one person feeling the pain of another and reaching out to relieve that pain, if at all possible. Paul mentions it in Romans 12, Colossians 3, a whole variety of places. My beloved colleague, peace to his memory, Alan Verhey, in one of his books. He's a Christian ethicist. He puts it this way: compassion is a visceral response to the suffering of another that moves us to want to do something in response to the other's suffering. So not just having this feeling, but you're motivated to do whatever you can, if possible, to relieve that person's suffering. You do 5 things, says Alan. You perceive the suffering, you empathize with the sufferer, you feel sorrow over her suffering, you want to relieve her suffering, and you will, if possible, do that, relieve her suffering. So, Christ, of course, for Christians is the exemplar of agape, which is one of the 4 words for love in Greek that's typically used in the New Testament to describe love. Greeks had a much more precise vocabulary. We have one word that has all these different meanings, and agape is the word in the New Testament used. Again, lots of references, but in the Bible. But love, I define as care and compassion that promotes the good of another for the sake of the other. The virtue of love, then, is this habitual disposition to care for the needs of others, promoting their goods and, notice, securing their rights. So I'm following the lead of Nicholas Wolterstorff and a number of other scholars, that love and justice are connected. You can't truly love someone and not also be concerned that their rights be respected, that they be treated fairly and justly. And justice all by itself, as Lou Smedes makes very clear in some of his writings, can be cold without compassion and love. So the two have an interesting relationship, love and justice, which is why I've paired them together. That love, if it's really love, includes justice. Not just caring for your needs, but respecting your rights and seeing that you're dealt with fairly and equitably. Care for the needs of others, promoting their goods and securing their rights as ends in themselves. Not because it makes you feel better, not because you can put it on your resume, not because it makes you look good in the eyes of people you care about, but for the good of the person or people or animals or place, if we expand this, for their good, as ends in themselves, not as means to your end. I think there's only one vice here, carelessness, but it takes 2 forms. And this, we could spend probably hours talking about this. This always generates lots of discussion. What's, quote, the opposite of love? Is it apathy or indifference, not caring, or is it malevolence, willing evil? I try to say it's both, but for different reasons. But if love is care, then it strikes me, for whatever, that the opposite of that is not to care, which is apathy or indifference. And we are out of time at 2:30. So let me conclude with a short story, and I'll leave you hanging with that question. I'm very curious, really, to see what you think, because there are always good arguments on both sides, and people talk about the opposite or the vice that corresponds to the virtue of love. And of course, it depends on how you define love. Is it apathy? Is it malevolence? Ecological love, just briefly down at the bottom here, the settled disposition to care about our house, our oikos, and its inhabitants, and thus promote the flourishing of all creatures, and not just humans. What does ecological justice look like embodied, by way of conclusion? This is the last story from this chapter on justice and love. Many names come to mind, but there are few more celebrated than Wangari Maathai, founder of the Greenbelt movement, co-founder of the Nobel Women's Initiative, recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, Indira Gandhi Prize for Peace, Disarmament, and Development, recipient of the Conservation Scientist Award from Columbia University and the World Citizenship Award from the Girl Scouts. Her list of awards and honors seems endless. Born in a rural Kenyan village in 1940, Wangari Muta Maathai was educated by Catholic missionaries and later received bachelor's and master's degrees in biology here in the United States. Went on to earn a doctorate degree in veterinary anatomy in Germany. She died in 2011. A celebrated advocate of environmental restoration and women's rights, Maathai is best known for her work planting trees as part of what became known as the Green Belt movement. She founded that in 1977 as a grassroots non-governmental organization based in Nairobi, Kenya. On June 5 in Kamukunji Park on the outskirts of Nairobi, Maathai and others from the National Council of Women in Kenya planted 7 trees, biblical number of perfection, 7 trees in honor of community leaders. This was the first of what became many, quote-unquote, green belts. Many more were to follow. Maathai encouraged women to plant trees and develop tree nurseries all over Kenya. Started in Nairobi and then her rest of her home country, using seeds from trees native to the area and paying the women a small stipend for each seedling that was later planted. Her goal was to help women by providing fuel for cooking and to stop deforestation and soil erosion. This was not just a program in ecological restoration, though it certainly was that, but also a way to empower women and fight poverty. It was and still is a rich example of how people can work together for both environmental conservation and social justice. There's another 2 pages on Wangari Maathai's story in the book, but I'm going to stop right there. As again, a living embodiment she was of both social justice issues and environmental restoration issues. Thanks for your time and attention today. We will pick up a few loose ends with justice and love next class and talk about the final 2 virtues, courage and hope. Thanks for joining us online, folks. Hope to see you a week from today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
You too.